I'm Angelo Vermeulen. We're doing our third and last podcast in the Dome of Visions here in Stockholm. And today my guest is Anders Sandberg. And we're going to, just like any other podcast, we're going to talk about the future of humanity in outer space. Anders is a research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford. And his research centers on management of low probability, high impact risks, societal and ethical issues surrounding human enhancement, as well as estimating the capabilities of future technologies. Sounds like quite a field you're working on. Maybe you can introduce yourself a little more in detail.
Yeah, it's the best job in the world. So I'm a lapsed computational neuroscientist. I trained here at the Royal Institute of Technology in simulating the brain and understanding how memory is stored. But then I got interested in can we improve the brain? And I ended up in the philosophy department of Oxford. And what we're trying to do at our institute is really think big, really think long term. What's going to be the fate of humanity? What can we do about it? What should we do about it? And how can we reason about these strange questions where we know pretty well that we don't have all the pieces yet?
So you moved from the brain to the future of humanity.
Yes.
Basically. Are you still doing brain research then? Or?
A little bit. I'm working on questions about how to copy the pattern of human brain into a computer. Both a technological question, when would this be possible? Is it even possible? There are deep philosophical issues, of course, but also scientific ones, as well as the ethical issue. Okay, if we copied brain into computers, how should we treat them? Okay. Maybe we need to treat them as software animals and software people and get ethics approval before doing anything nasty to them.
Yeah, but that's assuming that a simulated computer brain would actually start behaving like an actual brain, or...
If it's accurate enough, we would expect that if we did everything right, it would behave.
Isn't that a very reductionist approach to what a human brain and what humanity is?
It's a totally reductionist approach, and I think the best way of testing it is actually to try it. But if you got a simulated mouse that behaved like a real mouse, well, is it allowable to pinch it in its virtual tail? If we don't think it's allowable to pinch real mice in their tails just for fun, maybe there is a real pain in the virtual mouse and we shouldn't do that. On the other hand, others say, no, it's just numbers in a computer. It might look like a mouse on the screen, but it's not a real mouse.
It's an illusion, yeah. Those are very interesting topics. We're definitely going to talk about ethics because this podcast is focusing specifically on the ethics of space exploration. And my opening question would be, what is your relation with space exploration? Are you personally interested in space exploration? And one of the critiques that I get a lot when I'm talking about my work is that people are like, there's so many things that are going wrong on Earth. Shouldn't we just first fix Earth before we start thinking about doing stuff in space? So what is your relation to that?
So I always been thinking that, of course we need to go to space. We're already living there, except just on the surface of one planet. But there is a really important reason why we need to do more space exploration, and that is the survival of a species. So the one crucial result I think we have at our institute is that preventing humanity from going extinct has an enormous moral weight. It's really important. And one of the best ways of avoiding that is actually to have eggs in many baskets, to actually spread out in space. So the fact that a lot of things are going badly on Earth, and we could use resources either for that or for space exploration, might still not be a good reason to say, oh, we should fix everything on Earth. Because, first of all, that might actually take absolutely forever. And if we mess things up on this planet and go extinct, we don't get a second chance.
Okay, because those are kind of the two things that I hear a lot. You have people that are talking about let's stay on Earth and let's take care of Earth, and maybe then later in a later stage we can move to space. And then other people that have this very pessimistic view, like Earth is lost. It's going to be lost anyhow, so let's build a structure, let's build an infrastructure so we can leave Earth. And personally, my opinion is actually in between. It's in between those two. It's like we should connect those two visions. We should both take care of Earth and move and find our space in outer space. And I think that both can strengthen each other. I truly believe that by moving into space and finding our position in the universe, we can actually learn so many lessons that you can apply back on Earth to improve Earth. But waiting for the moment when Earth will be perfect utopia, well, that's like making the case for no space exploration to me.
Yeah, and both those views are profoundly pessimistic in many ways. The first view assumes that space has no real value until you have a utopian Earth. And the second view is very defaitistic about the Earth in the first place. You need an optimistic view that, yeah, we can fix things. But sometimes fixing things are best done on Earth, sometimes it's best done in space. And we already know that we've gotten some ideas from space which have been profoundly useful. Both the blue marble picture, which is kind of an emblem, I think, of much modern environmental.
Famous, right? Yeah.
The whole idea that, we're on this little fragile biosphere, well, people knew about it intellectually before the picture was taken, but that really brought it home. Mm-hmm. And then we have, of course, various aspects of the technology. The science fiction author Charles Stross suggested that, before you can colonize space, you should be able to colonize Antarctica or the Taklamakan Desert. They're much more hospitable, nicer places.
That's actually an interesting suggestion.
And I think it makes sense.
What do you think? You do believe that that's a good idea?
I think it might be easier to get funding for space, paradoxically, and to convince somebody that, we need to colonize the desert. However, in the process, I think we will both develop tools for colonizing the desert, and while developing those tools, start to get the impetus to maybe we can do the space exploration a bit of a side effect of the Chinese government wanted to do something nice with the desert, or somebody actually wanted to do something sensible in Antarctica.
This brings us to another trend in the field of space exploration, which is basically capitalism that is being spread in outer space. I'm talking about privatization of space exploration, with several mostly American companies developing private space flight programs, capabilities. Personally, I think this is a good thing that space exploration is moving beyond strictly government-controlled program. So I'm definitely in favor of it, and I'm hoping we will be able to share space exploration with more people. But on the other hand, we need to be critical about this as well. And you could really start questioning whether we're not simply copy-pasting existing neoliberal capitalist paradigms into outer space. I mean, the main driving force now of this is, for example, or mainly space tourism and asteroid mining. Those are two big drivers to develop commercial spaceflight. But you might wonder if this is really what humanity needs. It's tourism and destroying asteroids to get massive profits. For example, there's this interesting website which is called Asterank, and it ranks relatively nearby asteroids according to their value, if you would mine them, and the costs it would take to actually mine those resources. And the theoretical potential profits are massive. They're in like 36 billion or even higher. They're really huge profits that could be made. So what is your opinion about this evolution that capitalism is now moving beyond Earth's atmosphere?
Well, capitalism is interesting because it's very adaptive. The capitalism we're having right now is fundamentally different from what we had a century ago, and Adam Smith wouldn't even recognize what we're doing. So when you move it out into space, it's not just going to be a matter of copy-pasting it. It's going to evolve. The current ideas about asteroid mining are kind of mildly ridiculous because they're still based on this idea, there's platinum in the asteroids, that's valuable, and if we could just bring it down, we would get trillions. Except, of course, that if you brought down the value of trillions of dollars of platinum, it wouldn't be worth that much, which most of the sensible space mining people actually do understand. So you might start with space tourism and the asteroid mining, but it's likely that the real profit, the real business case is going to be something else, something we actually currently do not understand. Up until recently, the main business case for space had been communication satellites, which was definitely not what Werner von Braun and Korolev and the others were thinking about.
That this would be the major thing in outer space, communication, and then making money on setting up communication networks.
So I think quite often we assume that, because people want profit, they're going to be profiting in a standard way. Just look at all the science fiction where we have these little mining bases with space miners.
Yes.
Why are they mining all the time? Well, it's an easy environment to depict, and the actual activities likely to go in space would be very abstract, very different, and very hard to explain to anybody. But I'm pretty confident that if we're actually getting a big chunk of humanity living out there, it's going to be as weird as our current economy is.
Okay, so I like the idea that capitalism will evolve, and still, it's going to be a risky business. My fear is we will have the development of corporate strength that we have never seen before in the history of humanity. And it's because of two reasons. First of all, because of the massive profits that can be made that are incomparable to anything that has been done before on Earth. Because if that asteroid mining would actually become a successful business, the profits are so high. Secondly, because those corporations are not connected to specific territories on Earth. So you would get these non-localized megacorporations that, of course, would have a huge impact on politics on Earth. Because how do you handle a company that has the same amount of capital than an entire country? And if you have multiple companies like this would shift balances of power. And I don't think it's just a science fiction idea. I think this is a real danger there.
Well, the idea of an extraterritorial corporation that is essentially a government unto itself has one problem. Most corporations realize that being a government is not very fun. It's actually quite expensive. Governments are pretty good at specializing in being government. So typically what you want is you put your headquarters where it's good for a tax reason, and maybe you have a pliant government that realizes on what side the bread is buttered, which is what is happening right now with Facebook and Google all being officially based in Ireland. So I would expect something more like that. So it might be that the Maldives are going to turn out to be the great space power because all these super powerful corporations are all formally based in the Maldives, which is probably just an island just barely above the surface of the ocean at that point.
But sure, but that wouldn't reduce the problematic relation between the capital of such companies and existing politics on Earth, right?
However, the problem is, of course, politics happens inside corporations too. And if they're big and powerful, you might actually get some rather profound problems maintaining the structure, especially if you have long communications delays, if it takes a long while to move between different outposts and so on.
Yeah, that's very true.
So I think actually
that might be a problem.
I think we might see very different structures. Similarly, governments and the planned economies also have an interesting role in space. When you have a small biosphere, you probably need to run it not just at a planned economy because you have limited region, but you actually have a planned ecology. You actually need to maintain the number of species and individuals of it. As the ecology gets larger, if you actually can build something self-sustaining, at some point you run into essentially the same problem as liberal economists have pointed out for the economy. Actually, you can't centrally manage a large ecology. In fact, you want the ecology to manage itself and then nudge it in the areas where you really need it. So we might be seeing a lot of very interesting shifts.
That depends really very much on what kind of management style you use. And how you define management. Of course, traditional top-down management, which is very centralized, I can assume that within complex systems it's kind of naive. But then, as a biologist, I'm very interested in emergence, where you have some basic rules and some groundwork that's being done, and then the complex system emerges out of those ground rules. So there is still some sort of coordination. And still some sort of possibility to redirect things. But at the same time, you're not responsible for developing that whole complex system.
But notice, this is exactly the same argument that you would use for a free market economy too. Again, if you like a free market, you tend to believe that the emergence is going to make it work nice and well. And then, of course, the critics will point out the market failures, just like we find that ecosystems sometimes also go astray in various ways. The really interesting question is, can we get other forms of emergence? For example, the idea of a gigantic space megacorporation. It's easy to think about, but maybe that's not the stable size of a firm. Economists have been arguing about why do we even
maybe you think maybe it would simply be impossible it would implode anyhow.
Yeah, and turn into a lot of contractors or smaller firms
Smaller.
or something else.
That would be interesting to see, yes. My personal political view is definitely a healthy balance between emergence and regulation, because I believe that certain parts of society or a larger structure need to be directed mostly out of an ethical point of view to protect the weak and the weaker structures, because as an ecologist I understand the ruthlessness of nature, but I do not want to use that as a paradigm for human society, and that's why I have so many issues with neoliberal capitalism.
So the interesting thing here is that human intelligence and human ability to realize that, this system will evolve towards that attractor state, but it's a bad attractor state, either morally or aesthetically or practically for some perspective. That allows us to think about how can we modify the system to get out of some of the bad attractor states. And this is, of course...
What is a bad attractor state?
Well, that depends. So normally when you have a complex system, it tends to move to some parts of a possible space of states. And in some cases this might be a nice, well-functioning ecosystem, but it might also be just a lot of mold. And I think most of us would argue that, a space habitat full of mold is much less interesting than a verdant one where humans and animals and plants can actually live together. However, the mold might be a much more efficient use of mass to produce cells, but we say, that's not really what we want to go to space for. So I think a deep question is actually what we want to do in space.
Let's continue talking a little bit about the ethics of space colonization, and I'm deliberately using the word colonization and not settlement, which is a much more politically correct concept. First of all, there's a whole bunch of environmental ethics connected to space colonization. We already are polluting outer space. There is the problem of space debris, of parts of rockets and defunct satellites that are still orbiting Earth. There are also technological remnants on planets. There are defunct rovers that are sitting there on the planets. It's still, a low amount of debris and waste in total, but still we're adding to that almost every single day. And then there is the interesting relationship between colonization and plundering for resources, which seems to be the case when you look at these asteroid concepts. It's pretty much, because it's off-world, the whole environmental ethics is not being used, and you can just encounter or move to an asteroid and completely destroy it, because once again, like I said, it's off-world, so it's okay to destroy the entire structure. What are your opinions about the ethics of colonizing outer space?
So I think ethics tends to be life and observer centric, and I think it might even that maybe it should be that. You can say that you care about an abiotic environment, an environment like the Martian desert. It's beautiful in its own way, but what if there was a forest there? In a sense, we would have been destroying the Martian environment by putting something else in there. Similarly, the lunar surface, maybe that's less aesthetic by most human standards. Is it better or worse off because there is a moon lander located there? And I think some people would say, yes, actually even an unliving environment can be harmed by us changing it. It was shaped by certain natural forces and it's kind of got an integral organic structure even though there is no life. I think that's probably not very useful because there is an awful lot of structure out in the universe nobody ever observed. Most of the value seems to reside in life and in beings that can experience life. So I think actually...
So that's your departure point to define your ethics in terms of this? It's the inherent beauty or how would you call it of life? Is that it?
So in ethics we quite often talk about different value theories. So there are the moral value theories and the aesthetic value theories. So a beautiful painting has a bit of aesthetic value, but if I need to destroy it in order to save a human life, most ethical systems says yes, the painting has to go. Certain moral things have more priority. It might be that it's on the same scale, or it might be different scales. We don't know yet. I would argue that life has value, mostly because it can experience. Life has value because it can experience value. Even bacteria are actually sensing the environment and interacting with it, although they're not terribly smart.
So where are we then with life? If you say life has value, I think we all obviously agree with that. Is it on the aesthetic or moral, or is it both?
I'm not entirely certain whether it is on the moral scale. Obviously, when it comes to humans, we tend to say, yeah, there is a moral value here. And obviously higher animals, we have some moral obligations to them. Even if we're not full moral agents, there might be moral patients, we shouldn't be treating them badly. But I would also argue that many animals do enjoy and experience the world. They actually are perceiving it even if there's no humans around.
But interestingly enough, I think in conservation ethics, the aesthetic value is usually used to drive the whole enterprise, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at WWF and Greenpeace, they're focusing so strongly on the aesthetic value that actually I think as an ecologist it's a bit of a problem.
Yeah. Charismatic megafauna always wins the advertising campaign. Polar bears are big and mammals, but nobody thinks about the krill. And the little shrimps in the ocean are actually ecologically much more important for the whole ecosystem. The problem is, of course, ecosystems might not perhaps be able to perceive value themselves. That's a very deep question, really, what's going on when you have an entire system. And there are some forms of deep ecology arguing that actually it's the system that matters, not the individual. If you have to sacrifice individuals or even entire species for the system, let's do it, which I find to be a rather creepy position. But still, it's an interesting problem that the rhetoric is aesthetic.
Yes,
but
that's
I think
exactly
what we ought
yes.
to do is the moral part.
But let's go back to the topic of the conversation today about space exploration. Do you think it's okay to grab an asteroid and completely mine it and destroy it?
I think so.
You think it's okay? From an
is.
ethical point of view, that's not a problem.
Yeah.
For you.
If there was the only asteroid in the universe, then something irreplaceable would be lost.
Okay.
But we are talking about asteroids here. There are lots of them,
Yes,
and most of them
exactly.
are probably pretty similar. So I think the uniqueness of something adds to its value.
Yeah.
And life is interesting because it gathers uniqueness. It has a history. Individuals have memories and a growth path, while asteroids don't.
Yes.
There's some
that's a good
information
point.
in them, but not much.
Which brings me to the interesting the announcement from NASA this week that liquid water was discovered on the surface of Mars. We discussed it already in the podcast yesterday with Rebecca Millerstad and Kevin Noon, and of course, and I'm also interested to hear your opinion. There is a chance. First of all, there is a chance there is life. The chances of life are much bigger now, that there is some sort of life on Mars. But secondly, and this is the discussion that is raging right now within the scientific community, what to do with that water. Of course, scientists want to go there and check the water. But the problem is the rover that we have now on Mars, the Curiosity rover, has been decontaminated, but is not probably fully decontaminated. So there is a risk that once we stick an instrument in that water, it will infect the water, and the bacteria originally coming from Earth will spread over Mars, and it's a game over, basically. I mean, we've changed Mars forever. Now, this is planetary protection. This is the discussion around planetary protection. It seems almost to me like an impossible discussion, because if we really 100% want to protect planets from anything coming from Earth living, I think we have to stop doing any planetary. We have to stop putting things on the surface of a planet, and definitely not bring humans there.
Even worse, we would probably need to shoot down asteroids hitting Earth, because an ejecta from Earth might contain spores too. It's even the natural process that might cause cross-contamination. And this is,
there is still no... I mean, this is an assumption, right, that this can happen. I mean, there's no real proof yet, right? I mean,
and
it's been proven that bacteria can survive for a very long time on asteroids, for example, or let's say in outer space, not on asteroids, but in outer space. So there's a whole assumption that microorganisms could travel from one planet to another, but I don't think there is like actual 100% firm proof that this is actually happening or has happened, right? But,
and it's an important thing to find out too. So I think there are two big issues in the protection of this environment. One is the scientific one is the moral one about protecting an alien ecosystem.
Okay.
And the scientific one, which was the original motivation, because you don't want to go to Mars, find bacteria and realize, oh, I brought them with me. I might have destroyed my chance to finding out if there was original bacteria here. Mm-hmm. But there is also a very important question. If there is cross-contamination, that tells us something very important about the chances of life spreading through the universe. It's actually very important for understanding whether we're totally unique and need to regard life as something utterly precious that needs to be protected at almost any cost, or something that is actually been spreading throughout throughout space for quite a long while.
Okay.
That's very important for figuring out
what is your
course.
personal opinion? Because only a few years ago we realized, after all the observations from the Kepler telescope that actually was investigating planets circling around other stars, out of those data came the conclusion that there is more planets than stars in our own galaxy and probably throughout the whole universe, which is still at this point has not penetrated the human the psyche of people in society yet. I mean, we're still, if you would ask somebody to draw a galaxy, they will still draw a drawing with stars. You know, they leave out all the planets. So with having all these planets, discovering liquid water on Mars, realizing that bacteria can live in the most insane circumstances, what is your idea personally about life in the universe?
So I don't know about the chance of life emerging from the start, but once you get life, I think it's pretty likely that it actually might spread first inside planetary system because of ejecta and asteroids, and then gradually between systems too. Again, mostly by spores or something like that. If this is true, then there should be a lot of life in the galaxy.
Okay.
But this is a very scary thought because we're not noticing any intelligence. So either intelligence is very unlikely, which seems weird given the history of nervous systems on Earth,
or we're out of sync.
Maybe, but it's hard
Out of
to
sync. There are civilizations or ecosystems that have persisted in other star systems or on other planets, and they're just extinct now, or they're still about to develop into proper complex systems.
So the interesting thing is, in order to make the out of sync hypothesis work, the lifespan of intelligence needs to be relatively short, and that's very bad news for us. So from a human perspective, if
don't you think intelligence is actually always working against itself? I mean, look at the most successful organisms on this planet. They're like bacteria, ants, cockroaches, and I do, ants do have a certain form of intelligence, of course, but the kind of consciousness that we have seems to work against us. Look at everything that we're producing. For me, the ongoing development of even more destructive weapons, I mean, it's so, it's this thing that runs throughout history. I mean, it's such a beautiful proof that intelligence is actually constantly undermining itself, no?
On the other hand, we've only been around for about 200,000 years as our current species, and we're actually the most common large mammal of our weight class on the planet. So ecological, in terms of biomass, right now, we're super successful, except that we're intellectually aware, we have a lot of missiles pointed at each other, we can mess up this planet. But we're also aware of this problem and trying to do something about it. Many other species are messing up their environment without noticing and without any ability to actually modify it. So intelligence has the seeds for its own destruction, but it also contains the seed for fixing things. So if we come back in 1 billion years, maybe it's going to be that, by now we have lots of intelligence. There's still bacteria around, but there's also going to be various orders of intelligence. And maybe we would say, of course, the really high intelligence, the super intelligence, very, very few. And then there are these human level intelligence that are all over the place. It's very hard to tell, but right now the silence in the sky is a bit disquieting. Because if life is common in the universe, then intelligence must either be rare or it must be pretty transient. And it would be good to find that out. And this brings us back to the water on Mars. Because we really should try to figure out whether there are bacteria there that might have emerged from Earth, or maybe Earth bacteria from Mars bacteria, or whether they evolved independently. Either answer would be tremendously important. And the answer that, there is nothing there, is also important, because that would tell us that maybe life doesn't spread that much randomly. It would need a project where intelligent beings kind of spread deliberate life. This is, from a scientific perspective, super important to get right. So decontamination is important scientifically and for human species. And then, of course, we have a really tricky question. Suppose there are native bacteria on Mars. Maybe we're not doing anything particularly interesting, but they're native. What's the value of that ecosystem?
Of native species, which is related to discussions about protecting ecosystems on Earth, I think. Interestingly enough, we had a podcast, the first podcast in this series. Peter Rotzman, who's an engineer, systems engineer, working on satellites, and he was really like, personally, I don't care too much about finding life in the solar system. He was all about putting our efforts on finding signals from other civilizations or other life forms in outer space, and then just more focusing on that. And so it was quite. I was quite, as a biologist, and I'm also interested in astrobiology. For me, finding life in the solar system is definitely a priority, but it's definitely very different if you talk to different people.
You might have very different approach. I'm part of a United Kingdom SETI research network. The astronomers involved in looking for extraterrestrial intelligence, and even whether we should signal to them. So some of the members think this is a great idea. Others think this is the most stupid idea ever. We better not do it.
Stephen Hawking has been talking about this as well, right? Which brings me to conflict and warfare. Because what we just talked about is sending signals and then signaling other potential civilizations that we're here, and this might actually work against us. Space is basically the ultimate high ground from a military point of view. And right now, space weaponization is not legal, but I find it hard to believe it will not happen, personally. I don't want it to happen, but if you look at human history, it's kind of, I think it's bound to happen at some point. And in the podcast with Peter Ratsman and Mats Claesson, which was the first podcast in the series, we talked about once we would start colonizing the solar system and people would live not just on Earth but maybe also on Mars and on the Moon, the idea of interplanetary conflict is not unlikely. I mean, if you look right now at geopolitics, this could be translated into interplanetary tensions. So what do you think about warfare in outer space, conflict between different locations throughout the solar system? Is this complete science fiction? Is it something you would conceive as realistic?
I think a lot of it depends on the available technology. If it's hard, like at present, to send an object between planets, in that case, sending your missiles to Mars, it's going to take months, which means that you're actually going to have a hard time actually targeting something effectively, or the political situation might have changed during the flight. If it's very easy because you have powerful, fast ships, you get a very different dynamic. Similarly, putting a missile in orbit today is not very useful because you need to break it for it to hit the ground, assuming the ground is where important things are. If important things are in orbit, now they're very fragile. So if somebody starts throwing their weight around, they might not just harm the enemy, but their own and the innocent third parties, and so on.
I still don't think that would prevent, because
nope,
of course you're talking. I mean,
my argument is rather that it depends very much on the technology.
Technology will evolve and we'll get there much faster.
And people will do stupid things for a lot of very different reasons. If you look at the motivations for war, it actually turns out that the standard explanation, oh yes, people do it for resource and land, that's not the whole of it. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's religious, sometimes it's ideology, sometimes it's actually mistakes. It turns out that
war as a mistake.
Yes, it's pretty horrifying. But if you think about the First World War, a lot of that was a set of alliances and firm deals that actually forced a kind of domino breakdown of the entire European system because of somebody shot an archduke. This kind of accident can happen again. There has been a horrifying number of close calls during the Cold War involving very, very serious incidents with missiles. In 1983, Stanislav Petrov probably saved the world by not doing his job. He didn't make the phone call that would have caused the Soviet to accidentally launch a counterstrike. They believed they were under attack. They weren't. So in space, if you have weapons,
let's go back to space.
If you have long distances, you have plenty of time to figure out that you might have made a mistake. You have plenty of time for diplomats to do their work. If you're close and move fast,
yes, but
mistakes will be costly.
But that's what I would imagine. First of all, technology that makes it possible to travel much faster, and secondly, in between stations. So, and then this brings me to post-planetary design, which is a personal favorite topic of mine. It's the design stage where we design humanity not from and basically living on a planetary surface is one option, and there's all other kinds of options. There's space stations, there is starships, even possibly. There's all kinds of locations where humanity is thriving and developing, and within that context, I think it would be possible to strike much faster and to have a much quicker interaction between locations of people. It's the same thing. Imagine in the 17th century talking about a war between let's say Europe and the United States, people would be like, "What, really? I mean, it takes months to get from one place to another. That's never going. That's not. I mean, it will always be limited in one way or another."
But there is also something interesting about that scenario, because you knew the location of the other side. It's not like Europe could move away. It's not like Europe could disperse around the oceans, around America. Because if you assume that we live beyond the planetary surface, which I think is an eminently sensible idea, being at the bottom of gravity well is good for a few things, but it's rather impractical. Then you also can move around many of the habitats. Not all of them. Very large ones are going to be terribly obvious when they move about, and everybody in the solar system or beyond will know exactly where they are. But it's actually possible to disperse. You get second strike capabilities and so on. Yeah. So yes, there are potential for pretty nasty warfare, but you also get a political situation that's very tricky. And the science fiction author Ian Banks, he actually argued that one of the first steps to a true anarchism would be going to space, because if you didn't like the local government, you would be able to move away. It would be much harder to project power.
This. Yeah, that would be.
It's an interesting question. I don't know whether I believe it.
I now realize that my example of America and Europe is probably the worst example I could use, because there's a war of independence of the Americans against the British. It was a perfect example of a war of Europe and America. But I was just thinking that throughout history, they would have never imagined the kind of fast capabilities of striking in such a short time with this massive destructive force.
And I think that is a very important aspect. So during the height of the Cold War, probably the best intervention we invented to reduce the risk of nuclear and Armageddon was the red phone line between the Kremlin and Washington. That allowed a phone call, or actually a teletype message, to be sent in the case of a mistake to try to fix things. They had almost 30 minutes to save the world if something went bad. That's a slim chance, but it's still a chance. Now, if you think about Islamabad and New Delhi, they're just 5 minutes apart as the missile flies. So you get a much shorter window of opportunity to fix things if something has gone bad. So the size of space is sometimes an enormous advantage, because it's unimaginably large, so we might spread out.
It comes into play. So back to post-planetary design, designing for a stage where humanity lives not just on planets but on different structures, and planets is just one option. Living on planets is one option. Let's get to, and this is to conclude the conversation, let's get into the field of transhumanism. There's also people that are interested in the idea that astronauts, the concept of an astronaut would become obsolete, because you could upload a human mind into hardware and then send that hardware off into space. And then as a consequence, you would need things like life support and all these complex systems to keep a relatively weak human body. I mean, space environment is super hostile to keep a weak human body alive. And then the whole concept of post-planetary design would be kind of also obsolete, because there is a potential omnipresence of the human mind throughout the universe. I mean, that would be possible. Personally, first of all, I don't really believe that's going to happen. And secondly, I wouldn't want it to happen, because I am very much about the importance of the body as a mediator in experiencing the world and determining what it means to be human. And secondly, social interactions for me are also crucial in the human experience. So even though there might be experiments with sending artificial intelligence throughout space and doing interesting things there, I don't believe in that kind of transhumanist view, but I know you have a particular interest in that. I mean, it's part of your research, right?
Yes, it is, and I would argue that it would be very convenient if I could send a copy of my mind by a laser link to some suitable robot body somewhere else. After all, much less mass that needs to be moved, and it's going to move at the speed of light, and I might have a backup copy. However, I think it's important to realize that there are many, many options in between. It's worth noticing that Manfred Klein suggested the term cyborg actually as a form of astronaut originally in the 1960s. He realized that having humans work in space would be very hard, and they're going to be so dependent on the spacecraft and spacesuit that they need to be integrated. So he had this idea that you need to treat them as a joint organism. And I think it's very likely that we're going to, long before we actually manage to decode our brains and do something really useful with that or artificial intelligence, we're going to be modifying ourselves. First, rather mildly, and probably by having very smart environment, very smart materials and smart suits that help us. But gradually it might be that we go post-planetary in a lot of very different ways. Being pure information, as you say, That's not true. You cannot be pure information.
Okay.
You need a computer to run on, and you need a body to interact with the world. And no doubt, if you have an architecture based on a traditional human mind, you want to share it with other humans and have a social life. However,
so you think there will still be a significant element of physicality?
I think so, yeah. I think some people might want to move away from that, withdraw from it. We see that currently, of course, many of us live in cities and are very happy not to see any hint of nature. Others embrace nature and really want to get the dirt under the fingernails. And I think this is going to be true in space too. And we have kind of different benefits from the either approaches. We want somebody to do the math and never touch the material world. We want some others who actually dig around in the Martian dirt to see what fossils might be there.
I think it also depends on the goals of moving into space. If the goal is to do research, to explore, to satisfy human curiosity, I think it could be perfectly fine to upload human brain or artificial intelligence into remote robotic bodies, for sure. But I think if the goal is more, and something that I'm personally very interested in, is this spreading of humanity through space, then I think this is just a tool, and I would much more prefer to have actual human beings and social interactions taking place all over the place in space. So it also depends on that, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
So as I see it, living in space might encompass very different lifestyles, and I think we might actually speciate as we get further and further out.
So different human species after a long time in different locations?
Yep.
Because
and
there's
not
no
just,
more contact?
Well, I think it's more technological evolution than biological evolution.
So the human body gets technologically modified and then starts to evolve away
and
from...
some people will say, oh yes, uploading, that's a nice way of doing it. Others will say, that's a stupid approach. I don't trust that personal identity is preserved. I'm going to keep my cyborg body like God meant us to have, and so on. So you might see both a technological and cultural evolution, but also the distances play a role here. Again, very different environment, very large distances. That's typically what allows us to evolve.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we're gonna wrap up here. It was a wonderful conversation, and this concludes also the series of podcasts at the Dome of Visions about the future of humankind in outer space. And yeah, thank you once again.
Thank you.